We are sincerely glad you joined us for our live webinar today with Geoff, who will be answering questions on understanding FDA, essentials for briefing books in pre-IND, pre-NDA, and pre-BLA meetings. Geoff is a highly experienced, results-oriented, global regulatory professional with over 30 years of industry and agency expertise, with very strong strategic capabilities and a very solid technical background that capitalize on his medical, legal, and business backgrounds to allow him to take companies and projects to new levels of success in a variety of highly competitive industries, cutting-edge markets, and fast-paced environments. Now I'm going to hand this off to Geoff, who will be presenting the topic today.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you all for being a part of this today. We're going to go through several key elements around the briefing books. And there's not enough time today to go really into detail about each typical type of briefing book. So this is going to be a little bit high level, but I welcome any questions. And if we don't have time to get to all of them, of course, we'll always respond back to you on anything that you may have some queries on. So with that, let's start talking about the briefing books for some FDA meetings. And if we look at this for pre-IND, pre-NDA, and pre-BLA, those are going to be our three main categories. You start off with an introduction. It's critical that the briefing books will serve as a comprehensive document that will provide the essential information to the reviewers. Now, this may seem like common sense, okay, providing them information, you've asked a question, but the issue is you've requested a meeting. So you've asked the FDA to meet, you have put questions together as part of your meeting request, high level, and you have given a position statement. So with that, you're going to be then following up with, this is our perspective, this is our position on our questions, and here is all of the information that supports our position and perspective to what we've been asking you. So it's very important that they're well done, that they stay on target, that they don't ramble, because it is the tool that the FDA will use to engage in conversation with you. And it's that engagement that brings together an effective meeting and an effective communication. It can address concerns. It can facilitate improvement in where you are in your development, especially pre-IND, when you're talking about what are your IND enabling studies. So briefing books are more than just, hey, presenting, let's put this together. FDA has asked for it, let's just send it over to them and we'll talk to them on the phone. They are much more important than that. And that importance is critical in how you relay the information. They need to be well written. They need to be succinct. They need to be on target, no rambling. And you don't want to say any more than is necessary. You don't want to provide any more information than is necessary, because the more that you provide, the more you're giving the FDA the opportunity to say, that's great, here's your answer to this question, but we were reading about this, so what about this? So the briefing books are more than just giving information to the agency in advance and expecting to have a conversation is going to be run differently than the information that you have provided. Briefing books are generally, and I say the word generally because there's always exceptions to the rule, there's always specific types of meetings where you have a little bit of a different format. But for today in perspective, these types of meetings, of briefing books compose, you always will have an introduction. You have your product overview, non-clinical data, clinical data, the regulatory strategy, and then you will have a repeat of the questions for the FDA that you've already provided. And those questions that you're providing here will also have you as a sponsor, your position statement. So in other words, what have you answered? So if you have asked them a question, is something acceptable? And you believe that it is, as part of that is we believe that this is acceptable because you provide your answers and you refer back to data or information in the briefing book to support that information. So this is your general flow. The introduction. It's more than just saying, hi, here's who we are. It's more than saying, hey, this is a meeting. It's about this meeting. We're talking about this. The introduction, it sets the stage. It's your first opportunity to engage with the agency, even though it's not physical. It is the first opportunity for them to understand, why are we having the meeting? What is the purpose? What are you trying to achieve? What's the product? What are the key topics that we're going to be talking about? It helps the FDA to ground the attendees. Who are the subject matter experts that they need to be there? What is the context of this discussion? So your introduction is more than just, we are sponsor X. I'm going to meet with you on Thursday. Here the following information related to the development of our compound XYZ, or this is our phase 3, our pre-NDA. We're getting ready to apply for an NDA on product XYZ. Following information sums up our strategy, et cetera, and so forth. Thank you very much. It's a little bit more involved in that. So it's important that you take the time to provide an introduction, but you provide one that's well written and not rambling. The next section within your briefing book is going to be your product overview. Now, you as a sponsor will have been dealing with your product now, unless it's a pre-IND meeting. And even in this case, you will have been dealing with your product basically from inception. So you have a historical frame of reference and a historical knowledge that in your mind, you're thinking, I already know all of this. So you may not always describe or relay the information about your product in a way that somebody who has not been exposed to it, who hasn't had any meetings on it, or has not been a part of your development would understand. In the product overview section, you need to make sure, specifically if you're having a pre-IND meeting, that you have an idea of the product's composition, formulation, what you think is going to happen, intended indications. This is especially in that section, we start talking about the mechanism of action, intended indications. This is especially important in your pre-NDA or pre-BLA, because this is when you are outlining your strategy in this meeting as to what you're going to market with, what you're going to be an approval, what you're labeling, what are the contraindications, what do you expect to be the clinical benefit, where is this going to be positioned? So the product overview section isn't just a quick blurb like you would put in a protocol synopsis. The product overview, depending on the type of meeting, pre-IND or a pre-submission meeting like an NDA or BLA, you need to provide enough information to give them an understanding of the development, where it is, how it came about, what you want to do, and why this is important, especially if you're looking at your clinical benefit and pre-IND. Why should they help you get into humans? So the product overview needs to provide a product overview that is accessible, that is meaningful, and that is readable. So in other words, it can't just be text. You can't take it out of a protocol synopsis and drop it in there and think they're going to understand. It is essential that they understand your product to be able to understand and help you answer the questions you've asked, but to understand the rest of the briefing book as well. Be surprised how many times we have come into meetings, or I help clients into meetings, and we spend the first 10 minutes of what is typically only a 50-minute meeting of explaining what the product is because it was insufficient in the briefing book. So it's very important to make sure that that is well written. Non-clinical data. We all know that non-clinical data, it's important. It's how the product, the compound, the biologic, we know this, it's how it was developed. But the non-clinical data section is a little bit different depending on whether it's a pre-IND meeting or you're going for a pre-submission meeting, like in the pre-NDA or pre-BLA. What is that and what does that mean? Pre-IND meeting, you haven't done anything. You're going to a meeting to discuss how do you get your IND? How do you get the approval for what you're going to submit to be able to use this in humans? So in a pre-IND meeting, your non-clinical data takes on a much higher relevance, because normally you are going into that meeting asking, what pre-IND meetings do I need to have in animal models or modeling or bench tests that demonstrate the safety to the best that we can, that the drug has some type of expected clinical benefit, and it should be able to proceed to the next stage to go into a phase 1. That's really based on your non-clinical. And this is where you're going in typical pre-IND meetings. You are asking them, is our planned animal modeling correct? Is our animal model right? We're going to run these tests. It's going to be in mini pigs. It's going to be in rats. We're going to go into non-human primate. We're going to be doing the PK/PD. Here's our tox studies. In the pre-IND meeting, your non-clinical data is limited, but it is about your plan. It's about what you're proposing, and it's presenting what you have done to date, even if it is minimal and non-GLP. You're getting ready to run all of your GLP studies. So in the pre-IND, this is a much more important section, because this is really where you're going to be focusing a lot of your time in that pre-IND meeting. When you're going for the NDA and BLA, you've already done all that. You've done an IND. You've gone through phase 3. The product has been used in thousands of people, unless it's a rare indication or an orphan. It's been used in thousands of people. There's thousands of data points. Okay, so the non-clinical part of that is limited. It's typically a summary of the non-clinical data that was provided, PK/PD, tox, etc., that was used as part of your IND enabling. And then it's going to go into much more into the clinical information. But for your pre-INDs, this is very important. And it does discuss your animal, your pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamic, toxicology. And it's going to discuss what your plan is for that. It's about potential. In pre-IND, everything is about potential, that it should be used. We should be able to get the approval from the agency to move into humans. When you've passed that pre-IND stage, it's a summary, because you've already demonstrated that. You're summarizing the non-clinical data that was made available to the agency, but you're focusing more on the clinical data, which makes sense. Clinical data. In a pre-IND, not any. So there's really nothing to put into that section at all, other than your intended clinical trial, dose finding, dose ranging, whatever you're wanting to discuss with them, so that you will be able to present in your trial planning during your pre-IND meeting. But in the NDA and in the BLA, this presents the data from the clinical trials conducted in humans. Now, this will tie back to whatever your questions are. So the amount of information that you put in any of these sections is directly relevant in proportion to the types of questions you are trying to get clarity on or agreement on. You're not submitting an NDA. You're not submitting a BLA. It's a pre-NDA, pre-BLA meeting. So you are simply gathering information, getting guidance, getting instruction. So you're only going to present the information necessary to defend the position and the points that you have based on the questions. But nonetheless, it needs to be well written. It needs to be concise. It needs to have the information about your study design. What were the demographics? What were the endpoints? What are the outcomes? Okay, this is really where the opportunity to say, hey, our drug has been effective. It has worked. We have demonstrated clinical benefit. This is where all that comes in. And it's not just a list. It is a summary for an outside reader to be able to understand what you did, what were the outcomes, what's the benefit. And again, it should always tie back to the questions that you are asking for the purpose of your meeting. Nothing more, nothing less. And all of this gets to your regulatory strategy. So we've talked about some of the key components, but at the end of the day, it is part of your development plan and regulatory strategy is to hold these meetings. This was discussed probably years ago. The regulatory strategy was probably put in place at early development, pre-IND stage. So there's been a plan to have these meetings, and as you've moved through the milestones, as part of your regulatory strategy at each stage of product development, there are things that have to be addressed, which were probably identified in this rather large and lengthy document. This is part of that regulatory strategy, which you will take an excerpt from as to why you are there, the regulatory strategy. What is your approach to the regulatory approval, especially for the NDA and the BLA? Now, for the pre-IND, it's a little bit different. It's what you are providing in that section is what is your approach to your IND so that you can start your phase 1. What is that plan? What studies will you be doing in that non-clinical? And that's part of your strategy, what's going to be done. Is it going to be a 1A, 1B? Is it going to be a 1A to 2? You know, that type of thing is all outlined in this regulatory strategy. And based on your meeting, based on the purpose and based on the questions, this regulatory strategy section will provide them the background of why you are in the position you are. And it's important that if it's a proposal, this is what we plan on doing, this is what we have done, this is the stages that we are. For pre-IND, here's our plan for phase 1. This is what we're going to be doing. It's going to be healthy volunteers. And, you know, it might be rare and orphan, so we're actually going to go into the clinical indication. This is all summarized in your regulatory strategy, where you've also identified what you believe are the appropriate requirements and how these are being met. Pre-IND, you know you need toxicology, you know you need PK, PD, you need it to be used in animals, you have to have some sense of safety. So you have designed animal studies. You have designed all of these in your regulatory strategy. You've outlined it. You've put it in your non-clinical section as the plans that you're doing. This is the outline of my studies. Here's our intention to take this through. So we're going to do this. We're going to run these studies. We're going to go into the phase 1A. We're going to go into phase 1B. We're planning on having X number of centers. We're doing dose ranging. All of this ties together back to in the pre-IND to what you're doing in non-clinical. Your regulatory strategy section is providing the overview for this. In the pre-NDA and pre-BLA, a little bit more important. You've already done all the hard stuff. You've already got things in place. You've already got your trials. You're probably already through phase 3. You're getting ready to compile all of your data from the database lock, clinical study report, all of the background tables, listing files, all this being pulled together because you're going to be submitting an NDA. So you're going into the agency of saying, here's our plan. This is the plan. You've seen all our information from our clinical. You've seen our summary of non-clinical. Our regulatory strategy is XYZ. We're going to launch this here. We're going to also apply for the CTIS in the European Union. We're going to go for a centralized approval. We plan to have as the indications for use is going to be X. These are the warnings, cautions, and indications we're going to put on the product. This is the contraindications. This is the patient information leaflet. Here's how the label's going to look. This is what our box is. This is our approach to addressing the concerns that we had discussed with you in previous meetings. All of this is outlined in your regulatory strategy, so it needs to flow. It can't be chaotic. It has to be linear. It has to show progression, and it has to outline why you're where you are, what you intended to do, how you met these, and what the next step is going to be. Because ideally, in the questions that you are getting clarification on or that you have asked, they're going to tie back to any one of these sections, specifically the strategy ones, that yes, we are going to launch with it at this stage. We're going to do post-market activity to gain additional data. All of this is very important because you may have asked that question. They need to see that in the regulatory strategy that you've thought that through. They need the opportunity to read it, absorb it, and then be able to comment on it. This is often overlooked, unfortunately. A lot of times in the rush to do the briefing books, everything is about the science, the non-clinical, the clinical is talking about statistics. That's all very important. But if there's not something pulling this together that is telling them why, what are the requirements, how are we meeting them, what is our plan, then the agency has no frame of reference. And if they have no frame of reference, they will create their own. If they create their own, that is unlikely to be in line with yours. If it's unlikely to be in line with yours, then your meeting is going to be spending a whole lot of time of realignment rather than getting to the purpose of the meeting, which is information. The questions for the FDA. Like I said, that follows this. These questions. You put a summary of them in a meeting request. So you've already submitted your meeting request. Okay, you've listed the questions that you're wanting to ask, or the information you're trying to get, or the decisions you need help on, or the guidance that you are seeking. So they've got that, but they don't have anything else. You've just asked a bulleted question. That's it. Categorized into a couple categories. Is it non-clinical? Is it a clinical? Is it a statistic question? Is it a clinical question based on dosing? Oh, it's non-clinical question. It's outlining, you know, we have a question on our proposed animal studies to do this, this, and this. Our PK/PD data is expected to do this, but that's it. There's nothing else there. Now the briefing book comes in. You have to, what is your position? You as the sponsor. So you've asked these questions. You're not asking them because you have no idea. You're asking them because you have an intention to get a response that is ideally going to move your project forward. So you are presenting a statement of, we are going to be using a non-primate model to do X. We believe that this is appropriate because the regulatory requirements are X, as seen in regulatory section, which you referenced. Here is the study design due to, say, whatever you're quoting under the GLP for that specific study, who's ever doing it. This is where you can find our information and summary on the previous talks information, which is presented in table 4, etc. It all goes back to those key sections in the briefing book. So these questions, you can't change the questions from what you asked. So when you submitted for the meeting and were granted the meeting, you cannot change the core question. So now there's opportunity. You come in and you answer the questions based on what you're trying to defend. So if it's a, may we do this? You're explaining why you want. If you're asking them for guidance on something, then you're providing the background on why you're asking for that guidance. The questions can relate to anything that is necessary to move the project forward, depending on where you are. So if you're at the pre-IND stage, a majority of pre-IND meetings are to discuss IND enabling studies and information. So a large part of the questions are going to be about your non-clinical, your tox, your safety, PK, PD, your planned clinical trial, your planned phase 1. What's it going to be in healthy volunteers? What's it going to look like? How are you going to manage dosing? How are you going to deal with safety? All of that. That's the majority of the questions. But in that question, again, you're not just asking, you're framing the questions in such a way that you're getting a response that is beneficial or supportive to you, that provides you with the information you need to make decisions, ideally in your best interest. So it's not a, does the agency agree? That's not always the best way to do it. So you have to make sure that you are providing your positional statement such that you are defending what you want the outcome to be. Even if you're asking them the question and you're in your head, you're needing them to agree, you have answered the question as if this is already fact. Do you agree with our perspective? And just as a side note, when you're wording your questions at the beginning, when you're doing a meeting request, it's advisable to spend a reasonable amount of time refining those questions. Never go with the ones off the top of your head. Always understand semantics. Understand the benefits of doing positive and negative response questions. It's not always an asking of can we. Sometimes it's is it in agreement with. You need to be very savvy with how the questions are presented in order based on your positional statements that is coming out with what you expect the answer to be, so that you are basically pre-designing agreement or pre-designing guidance into what you're asking. The questions are designed to facilitate dialogue. Just remember, you're in this meeting. You spend a lot of time. You've applied for the meetings. You've created briefing books. You've created questions. They are the reason for the meeting. So the questions and your subsequent positions that are referencing the supportive information in the briefing book, which is those key sections in the non-clinical, the clinical, where you can discuss your stats, non-clinical, where you're discussing all those key elements. Your position is not a plug and play from the briefing book. Your position statement is like a test question. It's like an essay, a thesis. You have asked a question. You answer that question in your best defense, not by regurgitating what's in the briefing book, but by using the information that you have created and put together in the briefing book to support your semantic narrative perspective. It is to get dialogue, never open-ended. This is an FYI. If you leave something open-ended, the agency will tend to take the most conservative approach. Because remember, you're one of 1,000 companies coming in for meetings, so they don't have time to kind of pre-design and pre-debate. So if you leave something open-ended, you're very likely not to get the answer you want. So your questions that you supply with your briefing book that have your perspective, your positional statements and defense or explanation are very, very important. And they always will tie back to the supportive information, your non-clinical, clinical, your appendices, your graphs. Graphs are nice, visuals are good. You know, let's say a picture is worth 1,000 words. That works here if you're showing process or whatever it might be, if it's a CMC. All of this ties together. So you are taking, it's going back almost as a reverse circle. You started out with questions in your meeting request, high level, bulleted questions, key categories. Here they are, no other information. You then started with a briefing book and ended up with the questions with your position statement that we're using the information in your briefing book to defend and add value to the positional statement in those questions. So it's very important to take the time to have well-crafted, well-written, and not everybody is a good writer. Okay, we all know this. All of our different disciplines, we all do a lot of things well. Scientists, we all do a lot of things well, but not all of us have that gift of semantic excellence and structural excellence. So it's very important that you have people on your teams while you're going through this that have that ability. And it doesn't mean that the writer has to be a scientist all the time. It doesn't mean that they have to be a PhD, chemist. Because actually, those of us at that level, we kind of make the worst writers. Because all we do is deal with the fact. We don't always have an ability on the softer side to bring information, to do the coalescing. We're just factually driven, ABC, but nothing ties that together. So having good writers on your team as you're going through this, as you're going your template and crafting the questions and the responses and tying together fact with position and narrative, it's very, very important and always a great idea to have a good writer. Have a good regulatory writer or medical writer saying, I will take this information that you have just said and I will craft our position on this, tying in to this section, these tables, these appendices, these references. Because that's what they're very good at. And then again, at the end of the day, this is a representation of you, of the company. This is where likely the pre-IND, this could be the first time that the FDA is even interacting with you. So kind of like dating, first impressions. First impressions are very, very important here. So if, pardon the expression, if you have crap in, you get crap out. And that is very difficult to recover from because as part of these briefing books, especially at the pre-IND stage, they're looking at you to look at your maturity. How well can you form an argument? How well are you explaining this? How much oversight do they need to have to you? So that first impression is very important. When you get to the pre-NDA and pre-BLA, they're trying to figure out how good are you how are you going to put this together? Should we trust you? Have you met this? Do we need to micromanage you? Or, are you pretty savvy and have demonstrated that you're an upstanding, above board company and your positional statements are based on the best interest of patients in clinical, not money and commercialization? So having a good writer take all these different views, perspectives, and opinions, which are very valuable, and coalescing them into a narrative that can be read by a third party who doesn't share your same historical knowledge is, I would say, probably the second most critical, other than your content, second most critical part of your briefing book. And that's not easy to do. And it takes the input of everybody in clinical, biostats, regulatory, preclinical, dealing with toxicologists. It takes all of those different people to provide the intellectual narrative with somebody, then tying that together to make it readable, understandable, digestible, and flow. It's got to have a narrative. And that narrative is probably one of the more important parts about how you tie into these sections. Because again, as we talked about in the other slides, the sections for non-clinical, clinical, even the regulatory strategy, these aren't cut and paste. They're not divorced documents. They are not mutually exclusive. They are all referencing one product. And so it has to look like they are referencing one product. It has to look like it has a cohesive linearity to it, that the information being provided and the transitions to the next set of information is appropriate for the stage of development for the meeting in which you are having. And it doesn't appear that you just tried to cut and paste out of a protocol or out of a different document or an IMPD or of an IB and plug that into a section that has a title or a heading and then move on to the next, because that creates a disjointed, what they call a cognitive disjointed reading experience for the agency. And if it is disjointed and they will have multiple people reviewing it, what occurs is you actually get more questions and it will miss the point of what you're trying to do because they spent so much time reading something, or that they will read something and reread it and think, I think it's saying this, when that is actually not the intent, or that's not what it's saying. It just appears that way because of the poor flow, the poor narrative, and the lack of a cohesiveness in this transition of what is occurring. So when you take that over to the questions for the FDA, as I noted, it encourages the dialogue. It's part of your discussion. And you've asked very specific questions, whether the regulatory, study design, how you're going to do the data, how are you going to present, the contraindications? Is this going to be first line, second line therapy, et cetera? As you have those questions there, the ability for the transition and for the contents of that briefing book to mirror your positional statement and provide the appropriate support, reliable support that these non-familiar people have in the FDA. They might be SMEs in their individual fields, but they don't deal with your product. They haven't dealt with it since, inception. That this information gives them the ability to go back to your question and circle it back around to say, you've asked this was your position, your briefing book provided the following supportive data, ergo our position is XYZ, which hopefully is the position you're wanting to get on. So that's where this heads. There's then a conclusion to a briefing book. It just doesn't end. It's a summary. You have to then give them something to read that at the end that summarizes the key points. If you're calling out safety, if it's a pre-IND, what are your animal modeling studies? What's your proposed tox? What's your proposed safety studies? GLP, what is your proposed study design for phase 1? It emphasizes the importance. And then it sets the stage for the sponsor's commitment to the compliance. So in conclusion, you are going to make statements and you're going to agree. You're going to say, I'm doing this. We are doing this. This is our intention. Thank you very much. Please see our questions. We look forward to having, a discussion with you. So it does wrap it up. The planning, effective planning of a briefing book and your questions is an essential tool to have a positive experience. And it will then, hopefully, you'll be comfortable enough, you'll be much more familiar with it outside of the details. Everybody will have a larger understanding. So as a group, when you're attending this meeting, everybody will be more in sync from a narrative and understanding perspective, that you look forward to the meeting with the FDA. Not just because you have to, because investors are screaming around this. We're spending so much money on clinical trials. We've got to get this product launched. Not looking forward to it from that perspective, but looking forward to it because there is a familiarity, there's an understanding, there's a shared understanding of where we're going and how we're getting there and how we're doing it that allows everybody to contribute to the outcome. That's the importance of a briefing book. That is the importance of the content and the quality. And that is the importance of having it well written. I can't stress enough. Not all scientists are great writers. We're good writers, but we are not great writers to bring about that cohesive narration and the transitions. So it's very important to have on your team a writer that can take all this information and pull it together almost in a circular loop that allows everything to tie together so that there's a, beginning, middle, end, all of it makes sense. And then you have a very positive meeting where in the discussion, you're focusing on managing expectations or realigning expectations rather than explaining how you got there. Well, thank you very much on that. With that conclude, that's the conclusion of a briefing book, and that's also kind of the conclusion of the core presentation. So I'm happy now to look at any questions that anybody may have.
Thank you, Geoff. Excuse me. We will now move into our questions for today. We'll start with the ones that were submitted with registrations and throughout this presentation so far. That said, please do feel free to submit any additional questions that you may have using the Q&A feature in the bottom menu bar. With that, I will go on to the first question that was submitted by an audience member. What is the process for obtaining a meeting?
Okay, it's a good question. You have to submit a meeting request, and meeting requests follow a defined process depending on the type of meeting that you have. And the FDA publishes a guidance. The downside of what that guidance is it's a guidance. It's not absolute. And we all know that, especially post-COVID, there's been a struggle for everybody to keep up. But there is an appropriate form and a cover letter that you file, the type of meeting you're anticipating. You can deal with a type A, B, C, or D, or you can call it your pre-IND, pre-NDA, pre-BLA, into phase 2, whatever meeting you're trying to get. It's got to have a cover letter. And it has to have the information on your questions. Who's attending? What kind of meeting do you want it to be? A written response only? Do you want a face-to-face? Not as likely anymore. Do you want a video call / teleconference, which means they'll do it on video? You put all that in there with the dates. You have the form with your questions, and it goes in through the gateway, the FDA's gateway, which is the electronic submission system. That gets assigned to an FDA's a project manager who will then pick up this as a task, assign the meeting number, whether it's pre-IND number, a sequence, whatever it is. They will get that assigned, and you'll be notified via email and via the FDA system on, are we granting that meeting? Because they can always say, no, you may not be ready. You've provided 3 dates for the meeting. Are we going to meet any of those? They may come back with an alternative suggestion or provide another date. And then once you have all that, you start then proceeding to the timeline to provide the information requested within the timeline of the specific meeting that you're having. So there's a request phase that gives you a chance to start building your information. There's a confirmation phase where you determine if what has been provided by the FDA is acceptable or doable for you as a company. And then there's the actual meeting itself.
Thank you, Geoff. We will now go ahead and move on to our next question. How many questions should you ask the agency in each of these meeting types? And what are the typical categories of these questions?
That's a good question, because a lot of times everybody will come up with a question they want to ask, and all of a sudden in your initial conversation, you'll have a list of 20 questions. You never go to the agency with a list of 20 questions. So typically, depending on the type of meeting that you're having, and I'll use a pre-IND as an example, you typically don't want to go in with any more than about 7, absolute max 10 questions. I mean, absolute max. That's if the other ones are relatively simple. If you have some complex questions, you certainly don't want to do more than 7, and you categorize them. So you will have your questions like in a pre-IND. The majority of it's going to be, you're going to have your non-clinical questions related to your pre-IND study requirements. So you'll have questions regarding CMC, maybe one there. You'll have some questions on your toxicology studies. You'll have maybe a question on the study design for your animal modeling. We'll have a question maybe about your animal modeling. Then you'll have some clinical questions as you're describing maybe a couple about your phase 1, what you're going to go into, healthy volunteers, or if you're going to go straight into clinical indication. Do they agree with the transition of a phase 1A to 1B? After that, you stop. So if you can reduce it down to just a couple questions, five is great, 7 max, and make sure you're covering the key things that you need to move forward, not just because you have questions. This is not a forum just to randomly ask things. There are meetings that you can do for that. But in these type of meetings, you don't just ask, and oh, by the way, can we use XYZ? Can we use hard pressed over capsule? That's not where this comes into play. So you got to make sure you're keeping the questions to the key things to move you to the next stage. And for example, Pre-IND is what will move you into an IND so that you can get your phase 1 study done. Very distinct. You section them, but typically, absolutely no more than 10. But I usually say between 5 and 7 is a good number.
Thank you, Geoff. We will continue on with our next question. Should the pre-IND meeting be before or after GLP tox studies?
It's a good question because there's not typically a right or wrong answer. You're having your pre-IND meeting because you are making sure that in agreement with your regulatory strategy, your development strategy, that you are ready to go to phase 1. So that you have to have your IND enabling information. So what is that about? Do you have all your tox? Now, you may have some tox data that wasn't done GLP because it was exploratory, considered kind of your scientific studies, but it gave you information. The pre-IND is going to be during your study. So you will have designed your tox studies. You will have designed your animal studies. They will all be done under GLP because you're now going into human studies. So anything that you propose as your plan of what you will be running prior to submitting your IND is all going to be GLP. However, in the pre-IND meeting, you may have inherited an asset. You may be repositioning an asset, repurposing one, and there could be non-GLP studies or studies that were done GLP-like, say in countries that don't necessarily have that same standard or are older. So you can still reference those studies and use them, but anything that you will be proposing in your pre-IND meeting as you're moving forward will be GLP studies.
Thank you, Geoff. As a friendly reminder, I just want to let everybody know that you can submit additional questions if you have any using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen using the menu bar. If you have any questions, please feel free to shoot us a message. With that, we'll move on to our next question. What are the key differences, if any, between pre-NDA versus pre-BLA meetings in terms of strategy and contents?
The strategy, the intent is the same. You're going to be doing an NDA or a BLA. You're going to commercial. You want approval for your product. NDA versus BLA, you're looking at substantive differences in the types and in the compounds. You're not looking at a biologic, you're looking at a new chemical entity in the others. So when you're dealing with a BLA, a lot of that information is going to be geared not only to the clinical outcomes, but there's going to be a lot on the biological safety, et cetera. Whereas in an NDA, you're going to be summarizing a whole lot of what your intent is with your clinical trial program and paradigm and how you're going to respond to the regulatory requirements. So the differences aren't great, but they're subtle enough that you will be focusing on different elements, all of it related to safety, but it's a little bit of a different pathway to get there in those meetings because biologics typically have a different set of questions and queries that are needed to be answered, although you may have to follow a similar path to get there in development. Whereas in an NDA, it's typically much more straightforward and you're presenting your plan on that information based on predicate, focusing on the specificity of those sections and questions. So they are different they have very different reviewers and in the meeting participants. So they do have an expectation that they are seeing the appropriate concentration of information on the biologics and the impact of it as compared to pre-NDA. How are you planning for commercial success and launch?
Awesome. Thank you, Geoff. As also a reminder, we will be sending out some information links here shortly. You can use one to book a meeting or a free consult with someone from our team if that's something you're interested in. And then the others will be to sign up for upcoming webinars to be notified as those are being released and published. With that, we'll move on to the next question. What do you do when you don't have very much information yet? For example, at an early meeting such as the Interact meeting, the template of the briefing book remains the same, but much of the information is not available. What is the best practice?
The best practice is really present what you have and ask what you need. Because you're right, if you're talking in an Interact meeting, you're going in very early to basically confirm the requirements. What are the expectations? What will the agency expect to see from me in talks? If you're going into Interact, what is it going to be? If it's in oncology, what is the outcome? What are the data points? Does it need a biomarker? What animal studies would they expect? You know, is this going to go in healthy volunteers, or can we go straight into clinical treatment? You need to be able to present the information that is available at that stage of your development with the regulatory strategy and planning that you have. And that regulatory strategy includes your planning and all your non-clinical, clinical statistics. All of that's part of your regulatory plan. You need to present what you have, but you can't present any more than you can do. So it needs to be related to the questions that you're going in and trying to get the information on. That the information in the briefing book, even though if it's minimal, needs to tie back to defense of a position that you have. So not having a lot of information is not necessarily a bad thing. You just present what you have because you're usually asking them, is this acceptable? Or if in addition to what I have here, we run these studies, will that satisfy the FDA's perspective on safety profile? So it's perspectual. And it is situational, but sometimes you just don't always have a lot. So you're asking questions of which you can only provide minimal information for. The agency understands that early in development. So they typically provide guidance and they provide their wants, their list of, we wish you would do this, to give you a chance to go back and assess the information you're giving and see if that is possible with your type of product you have and as part of your development paradigm. If not, you'll come back for another meeting.
Thank you, Geoff. I have gone ahead and shared those links in the chat. So if you do have any questions that you would like answered offline or in a more formal meeting, we'd be happy to do so. Feel free to reach out to us at consult@criterionedge.com, or you can use that link to book a free consult as well if you'd like. Moving on to our next question, what are the key objectives of briefing books in the context of FDA meetings for pre-IND, pre-NDA, and pre-BLA stages?
What is the objectives? Communication. If you're understanding, as we were talking about, when the importance of the questions and the importance of your position in those questions, the entirety of these meetings is ideally for you, the sponsor, to come away with the appropriate information, agreement, consensus, guidance for you to move the product to that next stage or the terminus stage of what you're doing. It's a dialogue opportunity to ensure that you have created a successful approach. If you're doing pre-IND, do you have your pre-IND studies? How do you get into phase 1? Your goal is phase 1. So that is your objective, is to get the information that you need or that may be missing or you need clarification on to get you to phase 1. When you're talking about the NDA and BLAs, you're getting ready to go for commercial. You spent a lot of money. You've done a lot of trials. You've been developing this product for years. So at this stage, the strategy is to ensure that there is alignment on how you are going to be presenting this product to the agency for approval. What is the expectation? This is how you're presenting your data. This is going to be the conclusions you're driving to. This is your indications for use. This is the safety profile, is ensuring alignment. But as part of that alignment, that you've had a dialogue to be able to demonstrate the knowledge of your product and understanding of the regulatory requirements, that there, when you submit the NDA, it doesn't get stuck in loop after loop of requests for information or queries, that you've aligned this up front so that the review of your product can go through, ideally faster than it would be if you just submit it without that understanding.
Thank you, Geoff. We've got a few more minutes for some more questions. If you have any, please feel free to use that Q&A feature at the bottom to submit them. Moving on to our next question, where is the best place to discuss the commercialization plan? Is that in the regulatory strategy?
In the IND, you're not going to really worry about that. So the pre-IND stage, you only have a little bit of a reference to ultimate commercialization in your regulatory strategy, but that's typically where it is. It's in your regulatory strategy. So when you're dealing with your pre-NDA and pre-BLA, under that regulatory strategy, there's going to be a subsection of commercialization plans. It's going to outline where you're going. FDA, going to a centralized procedure in Europe. You're submitting in Japan. You're dealing with, Canada. The commercialization strategy, especially if you're asking specific questions around, what are we allowed to say? What can our label be? This is what our product, our PIL is going to be. That is the section where you outline that under your regulatory strategy, subsection commercialization. And depending on what the key elements of your commercial strategy are, that's going to depend on how detailed it is. You're not giving them your full-blown 5-binder commercialization strategy. You're giving them enough of the information for them to understand regulatorily where you're intending to launch. What are your timelines for launching in Europe? What are your timelines for launching potentially in Asia? What's your submission plan to the FDA? So you'll typically put that in your regulatory strategy section under its own heading.
Thank you. And also as a reminder, we will be sending out this recorded version of the webinar in the next week or so. So if you do come up with any additional questions after receiving that, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team. You can contact us at consult@criterionedge.com, or you can feel free to use the link in the chat to book your free consult whenever you'd like. You can copy and paste it into your browser or just save it as a bookmark, whichever is easier for you. Moving on to our next question. What are some best practices for preparing and organizing briefing books to effectively communicate with the FDA during pre-IND, pre-NDA, and pre-BLA meetings?
It's planning. Planning is important. You don't go into it cold. Don't assume it is going to be straightforward and easy. So the best practices are get the right people. So whether you've got your clinical team, you've got your medical officer, you got your non-clinical, your toxicologist, statisticians, you got your regulatory. Everybody needs to be there, and you start with what you want to know. So you start with the questions, and you spend time on the questions, and everybody has their say on the question. And your writer is there, and they're taking all this information, seeing the drafts, and they're refining the draft questions, and they're coming up the process. So the best practice is planning. It's planning and appropriateness. It's getting things done by milestone. The questions are important. You have to submit. You have to do a meeting request. And that meeting request requires advanced copy of the questions. So ensuring everybody spends time around those questions, understanding what you need out of those questions and what you're really asking and how do you word them. That is critical, that everybody is involved. And then you understand that what's your project plan? So if you're applying for a meeting on this date, when do you have to have your briefing book complete? So create a project plan, and that project plan needs to be managed so you're sticking to it. Otherwise, everything comes in at the last minute. You don't have time to do maybe enough reviews, or something gets missed because everybody's panicked because, development still goes on. So it's really important that you plan, you meet, you have the right people available, you have a writer there who is taking all of this, taking in drafts, providing back out draft 2 and 3 so that people have time to review it, and you build that in to the day-to-day of what you're doing until you know that you have your briefing book completed and done. It can't be an afterthought. It can't be a side thought. So it's important that you have the right people, that you plan, use a writer to help, and stick with the milestones. Stick with what you're doing, because once you've submitted a meeting request, the clock will start ticking on when you're going to get that response back. You need to be prepared and ready to balance the concepts of the briefing book and reading all this repeatedly until you're happy with it. And then you've got your meeting. So it's important that it's planned, it's managed, and the right people are always involved, and they don't treat it as just another task. It's actually quite important what you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you, Geoff. We've got time for one more question. How do regulatory requirements influence the content and format of briefing books for FDA meetings at different stages of drug development?
That's a tougher one because regulations change. And regulations and guidances around how you use data, the types of data that's acceptable. For example, if you're going into pre-NDA or BLA meeting, you might want to use real world data. Well, all of a sudden there's new guidances that are out on how to use real world data, which are different than the European ones. And you may be running these trials globally. So the regulatory requirements of what they're expecting to hear is one thing, but the regulatory requirements on how your product is developed in real time is just as important, because the system can change during your development, unlikely during the pre-IND stage. But when you're going from phase 1 to phase 3, you could be talking 5 to 10 years. Systems change in that point. So by the time you get to your pre-NDA meeting, the stuff that you discussed at your IND meeting and how that has to progress may no longer be valid. So it's important that you have a competent regulatory person on your team that is pulling all of this together. And that as all this is being pulled together, the content is addressing the latest and greatest concerns that the agency might be expecting to be addressed in your stage of development, even if it wasn't part of the original development 5 years ago. So it's evergreen, the continual evolution of development, of regulations, rules, laws, perspectives, opinions are all very important, because you have to adapt those into the different types of meetings you had that had to be reflected in the briefing books based on the information and tests and trials and animal studies that you have done and how they relate back to that. So at the end of the day, there are minimal expectations that have to be met, and they are produced in guidance and legislation. You have to make sure that that fits, and that what you're asking is in line with you being able to demonstrate that. So it is never a one size fits all. It is an evolution from your development plan, from where you start with the pre-IND all the way to your pre-NDA meeting. You have to know what is going on at the time, and you have to take all of that into consideration as you're developing the information and as you're asking your questions. Because the questions you would have asked 3 years ago are probably going to be very different than the questions you'll be asking now, even if you were at the same place, because the systems have evolved.
Great. Thank you, Geoff. Looks like we have come to the end of our time. Thank you again to all the participants for your excellent questions. If you enjoyed our webinar today, you may want to sign up and be notified of additional upcoming webinars produced by Criterion Edge. If so, you can do so by clicking the link in the chat. Also, as a friendly reminder, if there are any questions that we did not get to, or you have additional questions that come up at a later time, please do not hesitate to reach out to our team at consult@criterionedge.com, or you can also schedule a free consult or discovery call using the link in the chat as well. Thank you again for everyone that attended, and have yourselves a wonderful rest of the day.